Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to the organizers for a kind invitation. Unfortunately, I can't be there personally and visit beautiful Budapest, but I'm happy to join you from Florida, where we have around 29 degrees Celsius today. Let's start with a tour de force, if you will, because I got 20 minutes to explain what populism is and whether it is a threat to Europe or not. So I try my best to keep it short and precise. I will work with some empirical data here. So let's start the screen on which I will present the data. You should all be able to see it right now. I will start right away. If you are interested in the slides, you can also drop me a line and I'm happy to send the presentation to you. And you can also contact me by email if you got any further questions that are not being answered throughout today's presentation. So why are we talking about the topic in the first place? Professor Prof and Mrs. Martin made it clear that populism is clearly an important topic in our contemporary democracies. But why is that the case? It's not only the case because populists win in some countries. It's the case because populists gain a great deal of the vote share overall. Now, if you look at the two graphs here, the graph on the left shows you the average vote share from the 1980s in OECD countries to 2017. You can see that the average vote share of populist parties has risen over time. Now, if you look at the average vote electoral support for right-wing populists in Europe in specific between 1980 and 2017, you see that right-wing populist parties, they practically consume the greatest part of the vote share for populist parties overall. So whereas in some countries, such as Greece, such as Spain, to an extent also Germany, if we consider the party to left a left-wing populist party, which is a little contested. We know that there are left-wing populist parties out there, but when it comes to the question as to which parties within that populist spectrum is, if there is such a thing, are successful, we're looking at the populist radical right. And that means that we have to ask specifically whether this electoral success might harm, in a way, the democracies that we live in. To answer this question, I first have to deal with a problem, and that is that everybody has a different understanding of what populism is, especially in the European context. For example, some might say that if parties try to be especially strategic, try to imitate the opinion of the voters, try to chase the opinion of the voters in a way, then they're populist. And others might say that, especially in the context of political contest, if parties or politicians demand something that is unrealistic, some might say that's populist. None of these is. It might have to do with populism, but it's not part of the definition that I'm using here. And those who are familiar a little with populism research are pretty much know that I'm working with the definition by Muda, 2004. But I'm citing this paper that you see at the bottom here because you find a slightly different version of the graph that I'm showing or of the picture that I'm showing in this paper. So populism, at the end of the day, there are different definitions out there, but this is, so to say, the gold standard. You find others, for example, by Ernesto Laclau. But Muda has pretty much pointed out that to speak of populism, we need two things. We need two dimensions. The first dimension being the actor, the party, that form of ideology, whatever it is, needs to speak of a homogeneous people. So people need to be united by a form of common political will. That is the one dimension, us, the people. The other dimension is another group. So whereas the people are pure and decent and so on, the political elites are also a homogeneous group, but the political elites are described as corrupt, as self-interested, as aloof, as arrogant, overall not fit to represent that will of the people, whereas the populists claim that they do. Only if both dimensions are present, we can speak of populism. There might be parties out there that are somewhat people-centered, but not anti-elitist. There might be parties out there that are anti-elitist, but not people-centered. For example, the early Greens in Western Europe were anti-elitist parties, but not people-centered parties in this regard. Only if both are met, we can speak of populism. Now, why is that problematic with regard to democracy? Populism is a form of illiberal thinking about democracy, if you will. Why is that? Democracy consists of two pillars. Margaret Kennewan has pointed that out in the 2002 chapter, and others have too. There are many papers about that. One pillar being, in a democracy, the sovereignty of the people. We all know that the people make the decisions in a democracy. Yet, on the other hand, there's another pillar. That sovereignty of the people in liberal democracies, and this is what makes these democracies liberal, needs to be limited, because otherwise the majority can take over and can restrict minority rights, can actually establish tyranny if they wanted to. So there needs to be such a thing as a constitution and other restrictions to that will of the people. Now, what populists do is they overestimate and they give special regard to the sovereignty pillar while disregarding the liberal pillar of democracy. And this is what makes them actually illiberal. They say only the sovereignty of the people is what makes a democracy democratic. Anything that restricts the will of the people makes it undemocratic. Now, whether we speak of left or right populism does not so much depend on populism itself. It might depend on, as Müller and Kaltwasser have pointed out, on how they construct the people, whether they do it in a way of describing the people as culturally homogeneous and so on. But mostly whether we speak of left and right populism has not so much to do with populism itself, but with the host ideology that populism attaches to. So populism in a way is a thin ideology, as we say. It's a core concept that can be found with left populism, with left parties, such as with Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, in a way the left party in Germany, but also it can be a form of right populism that is nativist, that is based on cultural prejudices and so on. And this can be found with parties such as the AfD, such as the PVV in the Netherlands, which can come in second in the elections, which take place tomorrow, I guess, but also with the PIS in Poland and with Fidesz in Hungary. Now, the question is threefold. How substantial is the demand for populism? Are these protest parties? Second, how does it affect democracy? And third, are there any successful counter strategies? Now, first of all, the first plot that I'm showing you here is pretty much the defining space of political competition in Europe. We define political or competitive political spaces by two dimensions. Where first dimension, which you see on the horizontal axis, whether a party supports a more state-oriented or market-oriented economy, and the vertical axis, whether a party is, with regard to its societal values, more progressive or more conservative. And then every red dot you see there is a populist party. And you see that in Western Europe, you find populist parties all over the place. So you find very conservative populist parties, which is right-wing populist in our understanding. Such the AfD, such as ANEL in Greece, such as the Golden Dawn, such as the Front National. In this, it's still the Front National, it's no Rassemblement National. But you also find populist parties that are somehow in the middle, such as the Movimento Cinque Stelle, which is ideologically ambiguous in Italy. And you find left populist parties at the bottom of this left graph. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception of ANO 2011, which is a centrist, right-leaning populist party in the Czech Republic, most populist parties in Central Eastern Europe are highly conservative, which defines them as right-wing. But among these, you find a certain heterogeneity with regard to how they position themselves on the state market axis. So some are more supportive of welfare state measures, and an active state in the economy, and others are more pro-free market. but most of them are pretty much in the center. And now the million-dollar question is, does populism have anything to do with liberal democratic norms? And it does. So this data here shows pretty much a very, very, very strong correlation between two variables. On the vertical axis, the degree to which a party makes use of populism in its rhetoric. On the horizontal axis, the higher a party scores here, the less it supports liberal democratic norms, the more hostile it is against liberal democracy. And what you can see here, and this is why we have a strong correlation, indeed, the more a party makes use of populism, the more hostile it is against liberal democracy. So with regard to its overall profile, its ideology, its rhetoric, and so on, you can see that indeed highly populist parties, a lot of highly populist parties, are also highly hostile or strongly hostile against liberal democracy. Question is, why are they being supported? Does that mean that their voters are also against democracy? And what is the outcome of that if they're in power? So why are these parties being supported? So what we see here is actually from an empirical paper that has compared the reasons for the electoral support of radical right, radical left, and other populist parties in Western Europe. This is the data that we have to work with. This is concentrated on Western Europe. Now, it has tested a lot of things. Does class matter for the support of these parties? Does gender, age, religiosity matter? Does your skepticism or support for referendums matter? And so on. And it has done so for every party that we see in the columns here, so we can compare whether they have something in common with regard to what supports their electoral success in different countries. And what we can see here is that with the exception of the SVP, which is a very well-established populist radical right party, we can see that political distrust explains to a great extent why these parties are supported. We need to qualify this further. I'll do this in a minute. But the other aspect here with regard to the radical right is the support for these parties is to be explained by a negative view on immigration. Other studies also show that an overall right-wing attitude supports their election. Now, the other aspect here is that other scholars, in this case, Steven van Houwert and Stijn van Kessel, have qualified political distrust in a way even more. Because one thing is having a negative view on the democratic status quo. The other thing is wanting something different, having a desire for a different system. What we can see in very short is that the support for the populist parties, both left and right, is not only due to their issues, it's not only due to political distrust, it's because individuals embrace populism as an attitude. So populism is not only a rhetoric of political parties, it's an attitude that we find there. It's a political demand. So the idea that democracy should be for the people only and that the majority should decide everything, whereas the politicians can't be trusted in the first place, that is something that predetermines the support for populist parties, both left and right. Long story short, the support for populist parties is substantial. It's not just protest. It's a substantial support. It's a substantial demand that the established political parties cannot meet due to their position as established parties and their ideology. So question is, what are the consequences of that? And what are counter strategies? Now, there's a lot of research coming up also with regard to what do populist parties, especially populist radical right parties, do to democracy if they're not in power? Because in most countries, they're not. They do have a negative effect on the political discourse. There's very young research. I just read the paper today, so I couldn't include it here. There's very recent research that shows us that they have an impact on the political discourse, which we can say might be problematic. What happens when they are in power? Now, I'm not an expert on Hungary, so I don't want to insult anybody, but I give you a little assessment that a student of mine, Spencer Korb, and I are working on right now. We're looking at the partial dimensions of democracy and how populists in power do affect them. We're looking at 5 countries, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Greece, Hungary, and Poland. And what we're looking at is these partial regimes that we know from research, namely Wolfgang Merkel, define a democracy and contribute to the quality of that democracy, namely the electoral regime, political rights of citizens, civil rights of citizens, horizontal accountability, which we could translate as checks and balances, and effective power to rule. Now, I don't want to go through everything we see here. I just want to quickly tell you what we see is highlighted here. And this is that if populist parties are in power in every of these countries to a different degree, in some stronger, in some weaker, we find that they affect the checks and balances, the horizontal accountability dimension of democracies. And they do that by trying to have an impact on constitutional courts, that try to control the media and so on. And they justify these moves by saying, we embody the will of the people. They do this verbally in part in Poland and also in Hungary. We embody the will of the people, and those institutions, such as constitutional courts, must serve the will of the people that we represent also. So there seems to be a pattern. When the populists are in power, with the exception of Greece, but if populists are in power, what seems to be done is they do not abolish democracy totally. We don't know what will happen in Hungary 1 year, 2 years from now, especially in the pandemic. This is data from before that. But they are changing it towards something that we can call, with the Lewandowskian way, a competitive authoritarian regime or a hybrid regime. So this is what we're seeing. So what can we do? The answer as to what can we do is in a way a little sobering, because there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. And as a political scientist, what I will not do is saying what democratic parties should do now is X and Y and Z. I am not going to do that. What I can do is, based on research, I can at least try to identify different arenas and options that are out there. In some countries, one strategy works, but the same country might not work in the other country. Same strategy might not work in the other country. So it's hard to say whether there's a one-size-fits-all strategy. I would say there is not. So first of all, there are 3 different arenas that I would identify for counter strategies. That is parliament, the media, and party competition in general. This is the one distinction I would make. The other distinction is that there might be formal and there might be content related or informal counter strategies. Now, formally, I'm just highlight some here. Formally, what some parties could do is that try to isolate parties in parliament. And this is, for example, what they do in Germany. In Germany, the AfD in the state parliaments, but also in the Bundestag, is isolated by the other parties. And we know from history that isolating these parties, for example, in the interwar era, can indeed function also in the long run with them losing their support. That was, for example, the case in Belgium. It was not done in Italy and Germany, where these parties obviously were embraced, and we know what that led to. Also, what parties, of course, do is they try in parliament to take a counter position. The problem here is that when you take a counter position, you also recognize their existence and their power. But you can't ignore them, on the other hand, because they provoke you to react. This is how populism as a rhetoric works. Overall, what we see here is that I would say the formal strategies are pretty limited, and every problem with formal strategies is also that they affect liberal democracy as well. that might be useful and that might be the right thing to do in other cases, but you shouldn't just throw around in a way because, for example, party bans are an illiberal measure. They are there to protect democracy. They're not in place in every country. Not every country can do that based on their constitution. But for example, in Germany, whether the AfD is banned or not is also a question of whether one wants to protect democracy by, in fact, limiting it in a way. And there has to be a lot of discussions about that, I guess. When it comes to their content, lower right cell, here we find the most prominent counter strategies with regard to whether they are discussed in the public and in research as well. So there's a common notion that, for example, conservative parties should just shift to the position of the populist radical right in order to reattract voters. So in some cases, that does work, but not in all cases it works. In some, it might even strengthen the populist radical right party. Why? Because it gives them legitimacy. It legitimizes their position. This, for example, I would say was the case in the Bavarian state election 2018, where the CSU shifted to the right and the AfD gained a lot of votes. At the same time, what we have to acknowledge, and I'm working on a paper on that right now, is that the voters of populist radical right parties are hardly available for the mainstream parties. And this is not first and foremost due to their issue position, for example, on immigration. Because if that was the case, indeed, the center-right parties would also only have to shift towards the right to reattract these voters. That doesn't work. Why does it not work? Because the voting for the radical right, or the populist radical right, is also to be explained by populist attitudes. Now, populist attitudes in nature are anti-establishment. So an established party hardly can reattract voters because it will always remain an established party. Again, there are cases in which we can say it has worked in a way. For example, in Austria, where Sebastian Kurz did not change the OVP into a radical right party, but he changed it in a way that it became his party. It's now the Liste Kurz. So it became highly personalized, and Sebastian Kurz, interestingly, always had a certain degree of, I would say, anti-establishment habit. And that might have helped, along with the scandal of the FPO, marginalizing the populist radical right in that country. But again, this is one strategy in one country, and it's hard to draw any conclusions from that. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for your attention. And again, I'm happy to share the slides with you if you're interested.